Welcome to the Teaching Tuesday session for April 2025. Today we're doing an introduction to apologetics, and I do mean introduction because we are just barely scratching the surface of a huge field to which many people dedicate their entire lives. We'll start with some basics, like what apologetics means and why it's relevant for you and the people in your life. Then we'll look at an example argument or two from several of the big apologetic categories, like why we think God exists or how we can square up a good God with the existence of evil. One big difference between this session and other sessions is that instead of a single recommended resource, I'll be recommending a book for each of the categories. Speaking of which, I'm going to start with the definition of apologetics from the book Stand Firm by Paul Gould, Travis Dickinson, and Keith Lofton. This is a fantastic general introduction to apologetics that does something very similar to what I'm doing today. It's a survey of many common questions about and objections to Christianity. They define apologetics as an attempt to remove obstacles or doubts to, as well as offer positive reasons for believing that Christianity is true and satisfying. I really like their definition because it touches on an important point. People like to think of themselves as rational, so we should be able to believe something if we know it to be true. Unfortunately, people are less rational than they'd like to think. Something needs to be both true and mentally, emotionally, and spiritually satisfying for most people to embrace it. Jesus knew this, which is why he told people that the most important commandment was to love God with their entire soul, entire mind, and entire heart in Matthew 22:37. If we want to do apologetics correctly, we don't just present facts. We have to appeal to the person mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And I want to address a popular misconception about apologetics. If you ask the average person what they see when they picture apologetics in their mind, it's probably two old guys in suits on a stage having a debate about stuff that's so far out there you'd need an entire library to understand any of it. Now, being a giant nerd, I do enjoy watching these sorts of debates in my free time, but that is one tiny piece of the giant apologetics pie. So if you take one thing away from this talk, it's that apologetics belongs in every Christian's toolbox. Let's say you read something in the Old Testament that doesn't sit right with you, like God ordering the Israelites to wipe out the Canaanites. If you don't deal with the nagging problem in the back of your mind, it can kill your faith over time. We're going to talk about that one tonight. Or maybe you've got a friend that doesn't believe that God exists, or a relative that doesn't think the Bible is trustworthy. Maybe a coworker calls you out on your faith in front of a crowd because they don't like what the Bible says about sex or marriage. We're going to talk about all of these things tonight because apologetics gives you the tools to research and answer those questions and the confidence to do so. And finally, before we look at the objections, we want to ask a question that you should always ask when someone prescribes a certain action or interpretation regarding our faith. Is it biblical? A friend of mine used to attend a church that took bus rides out into the mountains where they would ring bells to attract angels. I probably don't need to tell you that not one bit of that is biblical. But in the case of apologetics, we are building from a solid foundation. We've got an explicit command to do apologetics in 1 Peter 3:15, which reads, "If someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it." We've also got great examples in the way Jesus and the apostles dealt with people and answered questions. It turns out that the way we carry ourselves is just as important as the information we're providing, and we'll come back to that at the very end. Let's jump right in with objection number one, that truth doesn't exist. Ironically, the type of person attending this session or listening to it later online is the least likely to think this way. So you might find this perspective truly strange, but you're in good company because until the 1960s, very few people would have expressed that sentiment. However, since then, two schools of thought promoting just that idea have become very popular. They're called postmodernism and relativism. Now, as interesting as going deep on postmodernism and relativism can be, it's a bit outside the scope of this session. Instead, let me give you some examples of postmodern or relativist thought. You may hear people say things like, there's no such thing as objective truth. Or, if there is objective truth, we can't know what it is. They may say, everyone has their own truth, which is correct to them. You may have heard the term lived experience before. People will say things like, someone's lived experience matters more than objective truth. And you may even hear the claim, although most people who have these views are atheists, sometimes you will hear people say that all religions lead to God. This is incredibly common in non-Christian colleges and schools, and it's leading to serious problems in our society. One example is the debate about transgenderism that seems to have popped out of nowhere over the past couple years. But think about it. If there's no such thing as objective truth, then no one could be objectively male or female. And so if some 40-year-old guy says that his truth is that he's an 8-year-old girl, well, then his truth is that he should get to share a changing room or a bathroom with your 8-year-old daughter. Obviously, we know that's not true because we recognize that there is objective truth. Now, we're also trying to establish Christianity as true. So if someone doesn't believe in truth, that's going to preempt every other piece of information we have to share. Furthermore, Christianity, and Judaism up to Jesus, is the only religion that makes provable real-world and historical claims. But if us finding archaeological evidence that supports the Bible, and there is a ton of it out there and more being discovered every year, if that's just our truth to someone instead of the objective truth, that's a huge roadblock. They could just completely ignore it, and that's fine in their mind. Now, the good news is this type of thought is self-defeating. Most people grow out of it once they get out of college and into the real world because it just doesn't survive being in the real world. If someone tells you that there's no such thing as objective truth, ask them if that's true. If they say yes, they just contradicted themselves. If they say no, why would they believe that in the first place? Or if someone works, ask them what might happen if they tell the IRS that their truth is that they don't have to pay taxes. The IRS agent is probably going to laugh and respond that his truth is wage garnishment and property seizure. Now that we can state things as true, let's do that in response to objection 2, that God doesn't exist. You might hear it expressed like that, God doesn't exist, or someone might say that God doesn't need to exist. They might argue that we can't prove God exists, or that there's no evidence God exists. Well, if we're defending Christianity, then God existing is a pretty big deal. It's probably the first question we need to answer after proving that objective truth exists. Fortunately, there are dozens of good arguments for God's existence that span many different fields and will appeal to different people. I'd like to experience just how different these approaches are, so we're going to argue for God's existence first from philosophy and then from science. We're going to turn to another general-purpose apologetics book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Frank Turek and Norman Geisler to help us in this. This book is full of great information, and once you start reading, it's hard to stop. It's one you'll probably polish off in an entire afternoon. Plus, Frank Turek goes around to college campuses giving presentations on Christianity, so he's heard every question and objection anyone could possibly raise, and he's a great resource and model for how you should conduct yourself when you're really under fire from somebody. We'll start with that philosophical argument. Now, philosophy is the study of knowledge. Philosophers try to understand what we know and how we know these things. One of the ways they do this is through thought experiments, and Christian philosophers have devised a thought experiment that points to God's existence. It's called the moral argument, and it goes like this. First, if objective morality exists, an objective moral lawgiver, God, exists. Second point, objective morality does exist. Third point, therefore, God exists. To really drive the point home, apologists will often pick an extreme example, like, is it ever morally justifiable to torture babies for fun? That's not a claim that atheists can't be good people or that atheists can't know right from wrong. It's simply an acknowledgement that there are some things that are objectively wrong no matter what any society says. For instance, the Allies were justified in stopping the Axis in World War II because of the atrocities they committed, even if those atrocities were legal and accepted in those societies. Now, these philosophical arguments are very polarizing. Some people find them to be the most convincing, whereas others see them as total nonsense. I'm curious what your response is to hearing the moral argument. If you're in that latter category, perhaps the next argument will be more helpful. Our science-based argument for God's existence is called the fine-tuning of the universe. Put simply, the universe appears to be precisely designed for life to such a low degree of probability that it is essentially impossible that it happened by chance. To simplify this and give you just a few examples, we can look at gravity. If gravity was higher or lower by 1 over 10 to the 38th of a percent in either direction, we couldn't have stars, planets, or life. If the expansion rate of space was 1 over 10 to the 5th of a percent faster, we wouldn't have galaxies. If it was slower by the same amount, the entire universe would have collapsed in on itself. There are similar probabilities and consequences for the strength of the strong and weak nuclear forces inside atoms, the strength of the electromagnetic force, the temperatures chemical reactions happen at, and many other things. And it also turns out that Earth itself seems precisely designed. If the chemical composition of the atmosphere, the amount of water, the rotational period, the axial tilt, or even Jupiter's size and orbit differed by minuscule amounts, life would be impossible. When we put together the probabilities that we know about and we discover new ones constantly, we can calculate that the chance of life naturally occurring on a single planet in the entire universe is less than 1 over 10 to the 138th. For context, there are 10 to the 70th atoms in the universe. That means the chance of life occurring naturally on a single planet in the entire universe is the same as finding one particular atom in one universe, and that atom contains an entire universe in itself, and you happen to pick one particular atom in that universe. That is an unimaginably small probability. Geisler and Turek named their book the way they did because it takes more faith to believe all of this happened by chance than through an intelligent designer. And in a few months, we're also going to do a full session on the arguments for God's existence. So let me give you a sneak preview of another fine-tuning argument. When we look inside our bodies, the probabilities of the molecular machines and processes we observe occurring naturally are even lower than those properties of the universe. In fact, there are a number of these structures and processes that are impossible to evolve naturally. When you add these to the low probabilities about the fine-tuning of the universe, it is essentially impossible that there wasn't a mind behind it all. Our answers to the first two objections weren't specific to Christianity. But now it's time that we get specific to Christianity. And that brings us to objection 3, which says that the Bible isn't trustworthy. Now, we're not talking about the information in the Bible not being trustworthy. That's objection number 4. We're talking about the book itself, the collection of writings that we have that claim that they are not trustworthy. For instance, people might say that we don't have the original text, that what we are reading are things that people wrote later or changed. They might say that even if we do have the original text, we're reading a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation, and that we can't trust a chain of 50 or 100 translations. And then finally, some people might say, even if the translation is good, it was all made up in the first place. Fortunately for us, we've got a book called The Word, How We Translate the Bible and Why It Matters by a guy named John Barton. He also wrote a book called The History of the Bible, which I would recommend as another resource in the same category. Essentially, what this book does is it looks at the entire process of how the original manuscripts were copied and saved, how they were passed down and preserved over time, how current, Bible experts will take those manuscripts and use certain computer techniques on them to figure out which is most likely, how to deal with disagreements, things like spelling mistakes, and then how to piece together the most accurate copies of manuscripts, and then finally, how people who translate those manuscripts get them to us. And what's really cool is we find out that using computer modeling and other advanced techniques, we have the best and most accurate copy of the Bible that has ever existed in history. And the people who translate the Bible do so with the utmost care. Now, this is such a huge field that we could spend hours, if not days, covering every single part of it. We don't have time to do that, unfortunately, as much fun as it would be. So we're going to zoom way in on one tiny little piece, which is just the New Testament manuscript evidence. Now, it used to be that people thought that the New Testament was written long after Jesus died. Some people used to throw around numbers like 200 or 300 years after Jesus' life. We know that's not true. Our evidence shows us that the New Testament was written within 20 to 30 years of Jesus' life. We do this with historical references in the books, references to government officials, or certain conditions in the area. The great part about this is that means that the people who are mentioned in those books were still alive. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And so if the authors were making things up, there were hundreds of people who people could go to and say, hey, the book says you saw this. Is this true? Now, we also have a ton of manuscripts left over. We have 5,600 in Greek alone, 26,000 pieces in total. We have, within 50 years of Jesus' death, fragments of manuscripts. Within 150 years of Jesus' death, pieces that fit together to make the entire New Testament. Now, we are pretty sure, well, we're almost 100% sure that we don't have any of the original pieces. But that's okay, because we're pretty sure, like 99% sure, that we have the second copies. And that's pretty good. That's better than any other ancient book. And what's really cool is a lot of critics will point to the number of variations and will say that there are 500,000 variations. How could you possibly trust what's on these manuscripts? But 99.9% of these are spelling, punctuation, and copying errors. Little things like they spelled John instead of John, Jhon, or whatever that would be in Greek. The 1% or the less than 1% are meaningful. They're changed names or words, but we have multiple sources to find the most accurate. And this isn't just people sliding pieces of paper around like they're putting a puzzle together. They're using advanced computer modeling and AI to compare 26,000 pieces all at once and get the most accurate ones. Now, we are 100% certain about almost every word in the New Testament and 99% certain on the ones we aren't. But none of the uncertain words have any impact on Christian doctrine. Put simply, the New Testament is the most well-preserved and accurate book before the digital age, and we can trust that we have what was originally written. And that brings us to objection 4, which is that the information in the Bible isn't trustworthy. People will say, all right, well, you've got manuscripts that have been preserved over the past 2,000 years, but what if what was originally written down was just made up? Or what if the people were lying? How could we possibly trust something that happened 2,000 years ago? Well, it turns out that we have a lot of good reasons to trust what's in the Bible. The resource for this objection is called The Fate of the Apostles by Sean McDowell. This is the most up-to-date modern look at what happened to the apostles, and that's one of the pieces we're going to use to prove that what's written in the Bible is true. You see, it's tradition in the church that Jesus' disciples, except for John, all died horrible deaths in maintaining the truth of the gospel. Basically, they were all threatened. They were told to stop preaching about Jesus. They declined. They were threatened with death. They kept on preaching, and they got killed, some of them in really bad ways. So what Sean McDowell did is he went through all the best historical records, and he looks at the probability that each of the apostles was martyred. And he finds that 6 of the 12 were definitely martyred, and the others, except for John, may have been martyred. There's historical evidence in either way. But what we don't have, and what he makes a big point out of, is that there are no records of them recanting. And that would have been something that was a huge deal to the Roman and Jewish authorities. If any of them had recanted, that would have been a big deal, and it would have gotten written down and spread out everywhere. So one of the reasons that we can trust the information in the Bible is that it's backed up by the deaths of people who maintain the truth of that information, and they are the exact ones who would know whether it was true or false. And nobody dies for something that they know to be false. Another reason we can trust what's written in the Bible are the embarrassing stories. Think about it. If Jesus' disciples had made up all of that stuff, they probably wouldn't have included so many embarrassing stories about themselves. I'm thinking of James and John basically throwing a tantrum and talking about calling down thunder from heaven to fry people, and Jesus gives them the embarrassing nickname, the Sons of Thunder. Think about Peter walking out on the water, and then he gets distracted, and he falls into the water. Think about Peter denying Jesus 3 times. If these guys were making up these stories, they probably wouldn't have put that information in there because it's really, really embarrassing, even 2,000 years later. And speaking of embarrassing stuff, it's not a big deal to us now, but the fact that there are so many women in key roles in the Bible would have been a huge deal back then. Women were not treated well back in ancient Jewish society. They were basically treated like property. It took multiple women to testify against a man, and a woman basically had no rights in that society. And so the fact that Jesus had female disciples and, following him around was a big deal. And then the fact that women were the first ones to find the empty tomb, if these guys were making it up, having women discover the empty tomb actually worked against them and people believing it. They would have written down that men discovered an empty tomb because a man's word was trusted. There's also some recent work on an idea called a disambiguator that absolutely blows my mind. Basically, they didn't have last names back then, and so authors had to use disambiguators to distinguish people. We have Mary, the mother of Jesus. We have Mary Magdalene. Those things, mother of Jesus and Magdalene, are disambiguators. Scientists and statisticians can feed all sorts of ancient literature, government records, censuses, things like that, into computer models, and the models can calculate what names are most popular in certain regions in certain years. And what is amazing is that it turns out that the biblical authors used disambiguators at the same frequency as names were popular in those areas. This would be impossible for us to do without these computer models, let alone somebody trying to do this thousands or hundreds of years ago. It is simply impossible that the authors got that right. We now come to 2 objections where critics of Christianity can even admit that what we have is what was originally written down and that the information recorded in the Bible is true, but they still won't be Christian because they object to God in a moral sense. The first of these objections is considered the number one toughest argument against Christianity, and it's called the problem of evil. Put simply, it says that if there is a God who is omnipresent, which means he's everywhere, omniscient, which means he knows everything, omnipotent, which means he is all-powerful, and omnibenevolent, which means all good, it shouldn't be possible for evil to exist. But evil does exist, so either God doesn't exist or God doesn't have one of those four properties. The resource we're going to use for this objection is called Rational Faith, A Philosopher's Defense of Christianity by Stephen T. Davis. And the defense against the problem of evil is called a theodicy. This is an explanation that tries to get inside God's mind. We're not coming up with excuses for God's decisions. We're actually trying to provide positive reasons why God may have made things the way that he did. Now, theodicies come in all different kinds of forms. They also address different types of evil. For instance, moral evil is evil that comes from human decisions. If I pick up a gun and shoot somebody, that is moral evil. And the defense against moral evil is called the free will defense. The idea is that it is so important to God that we freely choose to follow him that he has given us the free will to say yes or say no. But this free will is not limited to just our option to follow God or not follow God. It applies to all the choices we make in life. We can choose what is moral or we can choose what is evil. And so moral evil exists as a consequence of us having free will. On the other hand, natural evil is any kind of evil that doesn't come from human free will. For instance, natural disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes, or even things like injury and disease. There are many different answers to natural evil, but the one that I really like is called accountability. Essentially, God has made a predictable universe to give us moral accountability. Consider gravity. If I walk over to Bob and I drop a book on Bob's head, I know because of gravity that that book is always going to fall and it's always going to hit Bob on the head. So if I walk over to Bob and I drop a book on Bob, I'm accountable for that action. However, what if it wasn't predictable? For instance, what if gravity 50% of the time caused a book to fall straight down, but 50% of the time caused it to go straight up? So if I walk over to Bob and I drop the book on his head, there's a 50% chance it'll go up, 50% chance it'll go down. And so if the book does fall and hit Bob, I can say, well, that wasn't my intention. I thought it was going to go up. Now, the side effect of this is that because we have predictable moral laws, there are all different kinds of bad things that can happen from it. For instance, earthquakes are caused by plate tectonics, and gravity plays a big role in the plates moving over each other or going under each other. And so because God has given us this world where we can be accountable for our choices by having predictable natural forces, things like earthquakes are going to happen as a side effect of that. There are also theodicies that look at evil in a general sense. For instance, there's the greater good argument that God has to allow a certain amount of evil in the world, or he chooses to allow a certain amount of evil in the world because it leads to greater good. We could look at hypotheticals, like let's say a person has a child, and that child gets sick and dies. And the person's reaction to that is to become a great Christian evangelist, and they go on to lead hundreds of millions of people to Jesus. Now, we know that that child goes straight to heaven to be with God. The person is certainly going to be sad. They're going to miss their child, but they will get to see that child again someday. And God allowing that small amount of evil brings hundreds of millions of people to Jesus. There's also the philosophical school of Molinism, which holds that God doesn't just know everything, he also has the power of perfect prediction. This is based on a number of scripture verses where God says, if X had happened, Y would have happened. And so they expand this to look at the entire existence of the universe. And what they suggest is that when God decided to create the universe, he had an infinite number of possible universes he could have created. And he chose the universe with the best possible outcome for free will creatures. So there is always going to be some evil with free will creatures, but God picked the absolute best case universe. Some critics take the problem of evil even farther. That gives us objection 6. God does bad things. They say that God doesn't just allow evil, God does evil, or God is evil. So they may admit that God exists, they may say that Christianity is true, but they say, I'm not going to follow an evil God. Well, we have a great answer to that in the book, Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan. This book is incredible, and it examines a lot of the toughest cases in the Bible that really cause people to question God's goodness. One of these is the Israelite invasion of Canaan. To give you a little bit of context in this, basically, as God got ready to send the people into the promised land, it was already occupied by the Canaanites. And so God ordered the Israelites to wipe them out. This is a real sticking point for a lot of people who would say, how could a good God order genocide? Well, Paul Copan investigates this situation and provides 3 really good explanations that change our interpretation of the story significantly. The first is this: the Canaanites were doing some horrible things. One of these is their propensity for child sacrifice. As archaeologists dig up Canaanite structures, they find that live children were buried in the cornerstones of buildings, and sometimes, for really important buildings, multiple live children. They believed that their bloodthirsty gods loved that sacrifice so much that if there were live children buried in the foundation of the building and they died inside of it, that their god would bless that building. Now, it gets even worse what they did with sacrifices for crops. They believed that their god Baal would bless their crops if there is a painful child sacrifice involved. So they would build these statues made out of bronze. The stomach of it was an oven, and the arms were outstretched, and they were set up so that they could hold a baby. And so one quote-unquote lucky couple would have their baby chosen and placed on his outstretched hands. Then the priest of Baal would light a fire inside the belly of the statue. As the statue would heat up slowly, the baby would be cooked alive. And there were drummers surrounding the statue, beating on the drums louder and louder to drown out the child's screams. That is absolutely horrendous. Now, the second thing that Paul Copan points out was that God gave them hundreds of years of warnings to knock it off. They had at least 400 years of warnings to stop sacrificing their children. And not only did they not stop, their practices kept getting more and more barbaric. Now, even if you say that that doesn't excuse God's command to wipe them out, there's a third thing to consider. It's called ancient Near East hyperbole rhetoric. Basically, back then, it was accepted that people would exaggerate in their speech. We do this now with our football teams. We might say that the Steelers dominated the Ravens, or the Ravens destroyed the Steelers. We don't mean that the Ravens or the Steelers actually killed anybody or destroyed anything. It's just hyperbole to express how the teams played. Well, they did that back then too, and God knows this. So when God is communicating with his people and he tells Joshua, hey, you're going to go in and you're going to decimate, you're going to eradicate, you're going to wipe out the Canaanites, you're going to kill every man, woman, child, even the sheep, he understood that Joshua knew what he really meant, which was to kill the military-age males and to keep the women and the children alive. And that is exactly what Joshua did, because we read just a couple of verses later, after God gives that command, and then after Joshua says, yes, I wiped out the Canaanites, there's still Canaanites around. So we know that Joshua understood exactly what God meant. And God communicated in the language that Joshua would understand. And we could acknowledge that although God's actions may have been harsh, he was dealing with a very harsh situation. Now, that may wrap up the last objection, but we're not done, because there's one more thing to talk about. And that's the fact that in apologetics, your attitude and tactics are just as important as the facts. You can have an answer to every single question somebody asks. You can have all the information in the world. You can have the entire Bible and 1,000 different books memorized. But if you're a jerk, they're not going to listen to you. And so a great resource on how to be the best apologist possible is the book Tactics by Greg Koukl. He tells you how to talk, what questions to ask, gives you advice on dealing with all sorts of tricky situations. If you only buy one book from all the resources tonight, make it this one. You can learn everything else later, but you've got to learn how to talk to people first. Let me summarize 4 points from his book. The first is this: ask a lot of questions. You should be asking way more questions than you're answering, including Greg Koukl's big 3 questions. And they are, what do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? And have you considered? For instance, if somebody tells you that Christianity is just a prank by alien teenagers who came here and planted all sorts of evidence and they're all up in space laughing at us, well, first you got to ask the question, what do you mean by that? Ask the person to explain their entire worldview, and then you ask, how did you come to that conclusion? What evidence do you have that any of that is true, over the more common sense answer that it actually happened? And then finally, you would say to them, have you considered? And then you might present some of the evidence that we've talked about tonight. Now, we're not just asking a lot of questions. we want to, in general, be listening more than we're speaking. If you had an hour to share the gospel with somebody, a famous Christian pastor once said, you should spend 55 of those minutes asking them questions and listening to their life story, and then spend the last 5 minutes explaining how the gospel applies to them. Third, you've got to show compassion while being committed to the truth. You know, some people love arguing, they love debating, but 99% of people don't. People are going to come to you with legitimate questions and concerns. They may be talking to you about deeply held beliefs that they have had for decades. They might get angry, they might get confused, they might yell, they might cuss at you, they might call you bad names. You don't have to lie, you don't have to soften the truth, but use tact, use compassion, be gentle in your words, just like Jesus was. And finally, just like Jesus did, know when it's time to end a conversation. Jesus told the disciples when he sent them out, if a town doesn't welcome you, knock the dust off your sandals and move on to the next town. If someone gets angry about a certain fact and then you can talk to them and the conversation continues, that's one thing. But if somebody is yelling at you and screaming at you and cussing at you, and no matter what you say or do, it just keeps on going, or if you can tell that somebody is not in the conversation in good faith, if they're just trolling you or trying to make you upset, and they have no intention to actually learn about Christianity, maybe it's time to leave. Frank Turek has a great question. When he thinks that somebody isn't being sincere, he stops the conversation and he says, let me ask you one question. If Christianity was true, would you be a Christian? If the person says yes, he continues with them, no matter how difficult they are. But if the person says no, he ends the conversation. Because the person is not ready to change their mind, there's no point beating your head against a wall. And finally, speaking of Frank Turek, I want to give you one final resource recommendation, but this one is free. It's the Cross-Examined app. Frank runs an organization called Cross-Examined, which trains apologists. The Cross-Examined app has all of the questions and answers that he commonly answers. It has training videos, it has all sorts of different resources. It has conversation starters. It's one of the most amazing resources you can keep on your phone or your tablet anytime you're engaging with other people. And it's great. If you're in a conversation with somebody and ask you a really tough question, you can ask them to hold on just a second. Like, hey, my cat is texting me because I'm late giving him dinner. Give me just a second to text him back. And then you can pop up the Cross-Examine app, look up the answer, and then be like, all right, the cat's happy. Hey, do you know about the fine-tuning of the universe? You could probably be a little smoother than I was there, but you get the point. Anyway, thank you guys for coming out tonight. I hope you enjoyed learning about apologetics. We're going to dig more into a lot of the different areas in the future, but for tonight, have a great night.